Hello out there on Facebook. My name is Kellen Patey, and I'm the lead organizer at ruralorganizing.org. This afternoon, I'm joined by my two colleagues, Blanca Soto and Anderson Clayton, both of which are here. Hey, Anderson and Blanca. And we're here to share a little bit about a project that ruralorganizing.org has been working on for the past 3 months. Before I dive too far into anything, I just want to thank Anderson and Blanca for all your hard work as part of this project. And just all of this would not have been possible without you. And we're looking forward to hearing from y'all in just a little bit once we run through a quick presentation of some major takeaways from a round of interviews that we've been working on. But really quick, for those who are less familiar with ruralorganizing.org, one of our primary missions as an organization is to create resources that catalog and share best practices and skills in progressive rural organizing with civic leaders, with organizers, local candidates, activists all across the country who are trying to hone their craft and get better at rural progressive organizing. So through 2020, in addition to defeating far-right candidates in rural battleground states, much of our work was focused on conducting public opinion research in the form of a round of pollings of rural voters from across the country, tracking progressive issues and messages and what was resonating in rural communities. After the election, before anyone got too deep into 2021 and 2022 plans, however, we transitioned to a project that was designed to collect the lessons learned from field campaigns across the nation last year and share our findings with rural progressives like you so that we can all learn from our mistakes of the past year and build on the success for this coming year and beyond. So if you have any questions as well about this project, or you're interested in learning more about rural organizing, please email me. My email is right there, kellen@ruralorganizing.org. Would love to connect wherever you are. And then I wanted to get in and just define a term before we got much deeper into this slide deck. You watching this show are going to hear the word civic infrastructure be mentioned several times throughout this presentation. And to demystify that a little bit, all that we mean by civic infrastructure is local messengers using local messages to engage local people through local means to solve local problems. These are the institutions, the practices, and traditions of participating in civic processes in rural communities. And we found that they're very important, and we'll get into a little bit more about what this means for rural organizing, what we learned about it in just a bit. So before we get into our findings, I wanted to share some of the information about what our sample of interviewees looked like. In the past 3 months, we interviewed 70 rural engagement leaders who are working in 31 different states all across the country. 30% of our sample were BIPOC rural organizers. And all of these individuals were from 32 electoral campaigns, 16 501c3 organizations, 18 501c4 organizations, 5 super PACs, 3 volunteer clubs, and 2 unions. So a huge spread of experience, many different types of organizations, different regions of the country. And really, again, this is huge thank you to Anderson and Blanca for helping us put together such a diverse sample to inform all of the lessons that we're going to share here today. So many of of all of our interviews, we boiled down into 3 really key findings. And the first was that election year campaigns can't do it all. Campaigns are expected to do too much during on years like 2020. Organizers are asked to both create civic infrastructure and mobilize voters at the same time. And there's just not enough time for rural organizers to do both successfully. So, and then really quick, I'm getting, Matt, my slide deck's bouncing around. Sorry for the confusion on the slide deck there. The second key finding was that issue campaigns are the best way to rebuild the civic infrastructure that electoral campaigns really need to be able to leverage in order to win. These campaigns are ones that would focus on solving local problems that exist outside the arena of federal policy, of the vitriol of national politics, and they're focusing on hyperlocal issues. And the third key conclusion here is that candidates, when they are running for office, need to leverage those local issues if they want to win. We won't pass the solutions we need without changing who holds office, and candidates for those offices won't get elected without running on ground-up platforms. And so now we've got just a few recommendations for rural stakeholders that we wanted to get into. And we're going to divide these up into recommendations for philanthropic institutions, for elected officials, and then for rural organizers. So our first recommendation for philanthropic institutions is to support campaigns that empower organizers and civic leaders to solve local problems. Given what we learned about the power of issue campaigns that solve local issues, we feel that the best investments that we can make in 2022's electoral victories are investments in issue campaigns and campaigns that build relationships at the local level this year. Next, building on the previous recommendation, we feel that given our data, it is important that those investments are able to encourage collaboration between grassroots organizers and elected officials. If done correctly, elected officials will benefit by drafting informed policy and earn greater visibility in their rural constituencies, while simultaneously organizations will gain greater credibility with their communities as formations that can produce results. And then our last finding and recommendation for philanthropic institutions is that rural organizing is tough, and it can be dangerous for organizers of color, queer organizers, and women especially. If we want to build the infrastructure that we need and mobilize the communities we need to mobilize, organizations and campaigns must have all that they need in order to protect the safety and well-being of their organizers and volunteers. And now let's get into some of the recommendations for elected officials. So according to our interviews, job creation, access to hospitals and affordable care, broadband connection, anti-corruption, economic stimulus, racial equality, education access, and easy pathways to citizenship, small business assistance, and affordable housing are all more important to rural voters than ag policy. Each of those policy areas came up more frequently in our interviews when we asked what is important to rural voters than agriculture and farm policies. Of these, job creation is the one that job creation that reaches all demographics is the one issue that bubbled to the surface. Resources for rural economic relief and recovery in the most recent COVID relief bill is a great start. But if Democrats want to retain control of the Senate and the House in 2020 by mobilizing rural communities, we must deliver on creating new and non-extractive rural jobs now. Second piece of advice for elected officials is that many rural voters, even those that Democrats think of as being from base demographics, are skeptical when candidates don't talk about rural issues beyond agriculture when it counts, like during interviews and rallies and on debates. Organizers from across the board of 501c3s, 501c4s, super PACs, and electoral campaigns all told us that they couldn't point to enough specific sound bites or videos or quotes when candidates were talking about relevant rural issues. And then finally, we recommend that as elected officials begin drafting legislation to address these local issues, they do so in collaboration with rural community leaders. Then when it comes time to mobilize voters, those same community leaders contribute to the strategic decisions at every level of the campaign, from the messengers to the policy platform and the field strategy. We recommend that these campaigns also seek out organizers who are rooted in rural communities, as opposed to flying them in from out of state. So here's some tips and tricks for organizers. I just want to be clear that we're not trying to tell anyone out there how to organize your specific community. We say all the time at ruralorganizing.org, if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. And the following are just some pointers and trends that came from peers trying to answer some of the same organization questions that you might be. First, map local assets, networks, and leaders in off years. Taking this step of researching your community is crucial to building the team, or to building the right team and equipping yourself with an informed perspective going forward in campaigns. Second, candidates and organizations who took the step of knocking doors to canvass locals about issue priorities enjoyed far more relevant messages and a distinct platform that helped them start conversations with voters and work around some of the knee-jerk opposition to Democrats that we've all experienced in many rural communities. Third, many local organizers who participated in deep canvassing efforts felt that their work would have been improved by tying it more directly to an issue campaign or a ballot initiative, rather than just an election. Another recommendation that came from organizers was to recruit strategically. Recruiting one leader from a new community is often a better investment than recruiting 50 activists who are all in the same insulated social circle. Next, we found that several candidates were surprised by their success with local media. We know that local media can be a hostile place for progressives in rural America, but just based on our interviews, many were surprised at how badly local media outlets needed the content. So we really wanted to remind that that's a viable strategy for reaching rural voters, and so don't give up on it. Also, when we asked organizers how they came up or how they overcame some of the hostility that was experienced during canvassing, hostility to Democrats or progressives, we heard that humor, hyperlocal framing of issues, and then accurate local information helped cut through some of the disinformation and Fox News knee-jerk reactions that can hamstring conversations in rural communities. That being said, though, it is important to keep in mind that not all doors in rural America are safe for all organizers to knock on. We need to not send organizers and volunteers into places where they don't feel safe. And we need to prioritize personal security online and in person, and pressure campaigns and organizational leadership to ensure the security and well-being of all their organizers, especially those from marginalized communities to the fullest extent. Next, we recommend that organizers and local candidates engage more deeply with local, state, and federal legislation so that local activists and organizers are able to better understand themselves to build community momentum behind relevant policy and hold elected officials accountable to their home constituencies. And then lastly, of course, COVID-19 wrecked a lot of really carefully laid plans. But many organizations and campaigns adapted by incorporating mutual aid into their field programs. Organizers from campaigns that reported mutual aid as being part of their strategy said that it helped them build relationships with parts of their community that were harder to reach with digital tactics. Mutual aid also helped organizations and candidates distinguish themselves in the community. And I could go on and on and on about more of our findings, but I would like to hand it over to Anderson and Blanca so that they can share some of the anecdotes, cautionary tales, and bright ideas that they heard from helping with these interviews. So Blanca, if you are there, I'm wondering if I can pass it to you first. Would you come off mute and introduce yourself and then share some of the lessons that you came across in the set of interviews that you did?
Hi everyone. Yes, there were several interviews that we did, and there was a couple of them that really stood out to me. Particularly one of an organizer in Kansas who actually does a similar job that I did all through the electoral campaign last year. And, he pointed out a lot of things that really made me look at my work on an everyday basis and see where we need to do a little better, which one of them is really do a better job with recruiting volunteers from those local communities. Oftentimes in this really large geographic areas and our rural communities, we have to travel sometimes 2-3 hours to work in a community. And really, in order to be more effective, according to this organizer, we really need to do a better job at recruiting people from those local communities, because like you said earlier, Kellen, no rural communities are the same. And so in order to understand how that community works and what is important to the residents of that community, we need to do a better job in getting to know who lives there, what what issues are important to them at a local level as well as the state level. I think particularly for this organizer, he talked about some of the candidates talking only about agricultural issues. Well, that area in particularly, it's not an agricultural community. So what candidates are talking about, it really is not making sense to them. It's not important to that community. This is reflective not just in my communities in Kansas, but it is all across the state. I also had an interview with a wonderful organizer in another state. And, she talked about the misconception that what rural communities really are. And, a lot of the communities that she worked on are, 5,000 people. And she's talking about what really rural communities are, and communities are so isolated that, organizers don't ever really go there. And families and people, voters in those communities want to know what's going on in their communities, and they want to learn more about it. And a lot of that is reaching to stakeholders that are already established in those communities, which is something we learned in another interview with one of our faith leaders actually in Kansas as well. But that replicates through all other states, is that we don't do a good job into reaching faith-based communities, and they already have a network that is so tight, and they do a good job into reaching those communities. So we should figure out what kind of messaging we need by partnering with them and relying on those partnerships. So those are, there's so many interviews that we had some wonderful information, but those three stood out to me the most, because I don't think we do such a good job in reaching out to the faith-based community, because we oftentimes think that, they're not as progressive as we want them to be. But we just need to really look for those right partners, and they're already established and are trusted voices in those communities. So we need to do a better doing that, especially in those really isolated rural communities.
Hey, thank you so much, Blanca, for sharing that. And again, thank you so much for your work. I know that you were wearing multiple different hats. Blanca was super busy in 2020 and is now a local elected official in Dodge City, Kansas. So thank you, Blanca, for sharing your time and expertise with us here tonight, but then also with this campaign. And then I'm wondering if actually I could tag Anderson in. Anderson, would you unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then share some of your best stories from the interviews and best conversations that you had?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Anderson Clayton. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to be on with you all today. I honestly just have to give a lot of credit to Kellen and Matt. I am from a rural organizing background in the aspect of electoral organizing. I've worked on 3 major federal campaigns in the past cycle or 2, and then also have been really engaged with kind of the work that rural organizing has been doing throughout all of that. I've only ever organized in rural communities, and so I think that the work that rural organizing is doing is really important to kind of expand that research and kind of expand that knowledge and that network, because I think that it really is a network of rural organizers that we're tapping into today. So I want to thank Kellen and Matt for their great work, and also just the rural organizers that are going to hear this and that are joining us today for this. The work that you do matters so much, and we would not be able to have done this project without all of you. So first and foremost, thank you for that. But second, I also want to note how important this data is to collect. I think that there have been a lot of cycles that we've gone through where you have no information about what happened in rural areas. We only have kind of anecdotes and what Kellen was referring to earlier of kind of political talking points that we like to assume that we know what's going on in these areas. But rural organizing did a really deep dive into talking to people that have been on the ground for a year or longer if they've been in these communities their whole lives. And so me specifically, I focused a lot on talking to electoral organizers, people that get honestly sometimes dropped into a state and have to learn how to organize a community that they've never been in before. And if you're like me, you really enjoy that experience. But I think it also comes with its own set of challenges. And one of the challenges that I really heard a lot from rural electoral organizers this cycle was the aspect of messaging. And that messaging was not clear for rural organizers, that we did not have a predominant rural message this cycle. I've talked to many candidates and many organizers for statewide and federal campaigns that, when they had a question about a specific rural policy that they had, or that they wanted to know something about, how's your campaign talking to rural communities? And at times those organizers did not have the answers to them, and did not have the answers for them. And I think that's the most important thing to me, is because, if I don't understand, if you have a rural part to a district, how somebody can't talk to that rural community in that sense. So I think that was definitely just an issue that I heard echoed across the entire state, and something that really, I think, to me just strikes out at, these people are the ones talking to your volunteers and your community every single day on the ground. If they don't know what to say to them, I don't think your candidate does either in some sense. And so messaging was really, really, really important. But I also think organizers in general, who you hire, and hiring local talent. I saw a lot of campaigns this cycle that hired organizers that honestly, sat in a completely different state and never traveled to that state, never traveled to that community in order to really see what was going on there. And I think that when you're talking about hiring local talent and training local talent, that's a big part of campaigns that we don't do well enough, and we don't do to the point where it's detrimental to the campaign itself, because we're not hiring local talent. We're not reaching those local leaders, right? Because we don't have those connections in the community to begin with. And so I think the aspect of electoral organizing is something that we kind of need to come back to and reevaluate how we are perpetuating that and then what we're doing in the future for it. I'm really lucky to have had some really great conversations too, which is why I want to thank those rural organizers for what they've done. But I specifically want to highlight some of the campaigns that have been really, I think, creative with what they've done in rural communities. I think on campaigns, the whole concept is we're not going to be able to knock every door. Like the cost benefit analysis there is just not it. And I think what we talk about and what we suggest in the report of, finding these really key leaders that are not just, maybe not 50 leaders in a community, but that one person that has that network, and basically that phone tree of a network that's going to work for you. I think especially in campaigns, we need to start elevating more the opinion leaders of a community rather than just saying, how are we going to be able to reach every single person? Because feasibility wise on a campaign, that's not possible, but it is possible when you have the right people in that community saying your name and advocating on behalf of you. I think it works every time, and we've seen it very successfully. The other really great situation that I've seen from campaigns this past cycle is in Virginia, when they're running, when House candidates in rural Virginia are running a coordinated campaign together, I think is absolutely amazing. And it's something that they are coming up with their own messaging, because rural Democrats have to be talked to differently, I think, in every way, shape, and form than your urban areas. And I think that's the same that you can go for any party that you want to affiliate with. But I think that in general, especially this cycle, Virginia did a really good job with kind of creating that singular messaging that House candidates and rural House candidates got to run on as a whole in the 2019 cycle. And they're also doing that again here in the 2021 cycle too. So it's really interesting to kind of see that play out. And I'm really hopeful for those candidates that are running and progressive rural issues on their platforms. So that is my little spiel. Like Blanca had said, though, there's so much more to talk about. And I'm excited for rural organizing to kind of continue with this in the future, and also for all of you to read this amazing report. So thanks, Kellen, for the time.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you again, Anderson, for sharing your insight and your network with us. I know that you were super busy in 2020 as well, in I think 3 different states, was it? So, just thank you for bringing all the wisdom that you bring to the table. And yes, so the report also can be accessed at ruralorganizing.org /exit interview. Matt, is that link going to end up in the chat? Yeah, /ruralorganizing.org/exit. And so anyone who's out there, please check that out. Again, this is the results of 70 different interviews with rural organizers from across the country. And it's packed with all sorts of advice about how to make the most of the opportunity presented to us in 2020, equipped with the lessons learned from this past year. So that is, I think that's all that we have here. I think it is worth sharing that when we did this same presentation, I think 2 weeks ago over Zoom, and we had about 100 organizers tune into that meeting, we had a lot of questions from folks about, what can I get started with right now? And there were some people who were wondering, well, like maybe I need to work on my canvassing script, or I need to see like what is the spread of my email address or my email list. And really, as a group, we sort of got into the nuts and bolts of it and realized that a crucial first step for this year, as Blanca and Anderson have alluded to as well, is just doing that community mapping, and figuring out what groups of people are where, and what are the community leaders in different subpopulations of your town. That is an essential place to start. And it's essential to preserving the momentum from this past year. So again, please check out the report. Please get started with that community mapping. And I think...
Kelly, I think that, or at least Matt popped a question in the Facebook or under the Facebook chat, and I'm not sure if you're interested in answering that, but I definitely.
Yeah. Top issues that we heard on the doors. What do you wish your candidates were talking about? Yeah. Well, is there an answer that you would want to tag in for that, Anderson?
Yeah, I think, and it's because it's something that I heard from a lot of the organizers that we spoke to, actually, which I think is, a lot of the, it's not to any fault. Like, I think COVID hit us in a really put us in a really hard predicament, honestly, to the point where that was a lot of what we did talk about at the doors. But I think from a lot of the organizers, what I heard is that, we talked about COVID from a healthcare perspective always, whereas we could have talked about COVID from a jobs perspective and an economic perspective. And that's something in rural areas is, you know best, Callum, but rural economic development is something that we're really struggling with. And I think, like you said, anti-extraction policies and what does that look like? What do those jobs look like? I think is something that a lot of candidates are really looking for right now, and especially to put along with a platform. And so I think that is definitely one of the top issues that I heard, that, organizers were disappointed that they did not talk more about on the doors, and that, the community members were more interested in hearing more about that than honestly they were healthcare at that point in time. And that's not to say that healthcare is not an issue that's extremely important in rural communities, but it's just to say that this pandemic put the economy, I think, a little bit more before that in some ways in rural communities.
Yeah. Yeah. Blanca, is there anything that you would want to contribute to that question?
Yes, and I couldn't hear everything that Anderson was talking about, but I will say that the top three things that I keep hearing was broadband. I think it doesn't matter what state we talk to organizers, that was the number one need. I will say that was the top. Rural healthcare, including Medicaid expansion, was another big one that kept coming up, as well as probably the third one, encompassing a lot of different rural prosperity, community development, including workforce development, and economic growth. Those will probably be the three biggest ones. Within the last one, we kept hearing, utilities and some other things, but that was probably the top three. It was curious. Almost every interview that we did, our internet on both ends, mine and that of the interview, the person we interviewed, all of our phone calls kept, our internet was horrible. And, that was, again, one of the something to point out, because, mobile broadband is very much a need, and especially those really rural communities.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little caveat that you have to put at the beginning of everything you say, right, Blanca? Like before you did your interviews, and Kellen, I'm sure you had the same experience, but like the aspect of using or just communicating with some of the people that we were trying to interview for this project was really hard to do sometimes, right? Like over Zoom and communicating with them like that, just because of lack of broadband. But I think that is one good thing that came of COVID, right? Is for us to talk more about that. Like beforehand, broadband was not an issue that we saw, millions of people getting upset over. It was a lot of rural communities, and a lot of people saying, and I think people like me that accepted, the broadband at my house may not ever be the best thing that I'll ever see because of where I live. And I think that what people realized from COVID is that no, like we deserve this. Like broadband is not a luxury, it is a utility, and it should always be. So I think it was a good thing that came out of this, honestly.
Definitely. Yep. And I resonate with each of those. I really feel like, the rural jobs bubbling to the top, as well as the economic possibility, as well as the educational possibility and healthcare possibility that comes from reliable rural broadband were crucial. What I would only add to these answers is that many of the organizers that I spoke with talked about a need to go further in terms of the framing that we offer rural voters for things that we think of as being bread and butter progressive issues. I think that healthcare for all is an excellent example of this. And the most effective rural organizers and rural candidates and rural organizations were ones who didn't just talk about healthcare for all, but instead we're saying we need to open this specific hospital, right? Or we need to reopen this maternity ward, or we need to have access to this form of care in this community. Mm-hmm. Infrastructure is another great one. Some of the best canvassers that I've talked to as part of this project would knock on doors or call someone on their phone. And when we talked about infrastructure, it wasn't just, hey, we need to fix potholes and build bridges. It was, we need to fix this bridge in your town. We need to fix those potholes right in front of your house on this road. And understanding that while some of those details may seem meticulous, and how would we fit that level of local research into an electoral campaign, they went a long way. And the best candidates who I spoke with, the best organizations who I spoke with, took the time to zoom into that level, and I would say that they felt like it paid off. And also the ones who are continuing on, whether as an elected official or continuing an organization, feel like they're much better equipped to continue their momentum through this year. So yeah, that's all that I would add.
I think you can take broadband and make it that same example. Broadband is going to become kind of like that cliche, like we're going to like broadband access, like that's going to be on my platform as a candidate, in 2022, because I realize that's important, or 2021, because I realize that's important. But what I want to know is like, how are you going to have a plan to expand broadband? Because state legislatures have done all they can to make it harder for us to work with, providers and make that possible. How are you going to work with your community co-ops? Like, how are you going to make that plan possible? And I think that is what I would want to see from a candidate in a rural area in any cycle after this, is give me your plan for how you're going to make that happen.
Yep. Definitely. I think it makes sense. If there's any more questions, Matt, or from the viewers, I don't know what the best form for sharing that. If you would drop any questions in the comments, I can make sure that I can get them answered. And if you want to ask a specific question to Blanca or Anderson as well, please throw a comment in the chat and we can do our best to answer it.
Helen, what was your, I don't know if we got an anecdotal story from you about like, what was the best interview that you conducted? Like, what was the person that gave you the best idea and whatnot? I'd love to hear your perspective on that too.
Yeah, I would say, I think one of the, I think that a lot of my reflections coming out of this project have been about how to build the right foundation that is needed to sustain and support a really robust electoral program. And I think that the folks at West Virginia Can't Wait really exemplified good groundwork laying. For those who aren't familiar, West Virginia Can't Wait is a movement to support a slate of progressive candidates in West Virginia that is led by Stephen Smith and Katie Lauer. And I'm sure that I would, if I went on into the amount of people who owe credit or who deserve credit for that work, we'd spend the rest of the hour doing that. But they embarked on years, literally years of conversations, one-to-ones, and community events to build a platform that was from the ground up. And I think that when it came time to turn out voters, they benefited from having a platform that was more West Virginian than I think anything that they were up against. I think that they would also say that the project of this year and this election cycle was to build a network of West Virginians who are ready for big change, and using the election year energy and opportunity as a way to further their network, to devise a relevant platform. But all of that infrastructure is alive and well and ready both for improving, conditions in West Virginia this year, through local races and issue campaigns, as well as more shots at state house seats in 2022. So I think that would have been a really sort of the success story that I would point to. And then a cautionary tale was interesting. There was one that came to mind where we had a chance to speak to two organizers who were working on the same campaign. And they were speaking about, not having a rural agenda to take to voters from this candidate. Unfortunately, this candidate lost their seat. And when ruralorganizing.org went back and looked at to see, well, was this candidate taking pro-rural stances? We were blown away by the level of, or just by the caliber of rural policy that this person was forwarding in Congress, and realized that it wasn't that this candidate didn't care about rural issues. It's that there was a disconnect between this candidate as a policymaker and this candidate as someone who was trying to win an election. And the organizers weren't equipped with the full scope, and rural constituencies clearly weren't an emphasized part of that field program because there wasn't a rural agenda that was shared with rural organizers. So I would say that those would be my two anecdotes. So yeah, and I know that we're gonna wrap up here, but if there's any more questions out there in the audience, please feel free to drop a comment. Or, if you're watching this and we're not live, you can reach out to me at kellen@ruralorganizing.org. And then again, the full report is available at ruralorganizing.org/exit. Please give it a look. Blanca and Anderson, just another huge thank you from me and the rest of the Rural Organizing team for all the hard work that y'all put into this. Would not have been possible without y'all. And I think I can speak for all the viewers that this has been really, really informative. And looking forward to putting it to use this year and beyond.
Thank you, Kellen, for everything. We really appreciate it. And Blanca, same to you. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. I'm excited that you are going to get to hopefully be the next and be the progressive leader that we are looking for in local office. So I'm excited about your tenure.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. Oh, Blanca, were you going to say something? Sorry.
No, I'm just excited. This was really, it made us, like I said, take a look at the work that we're doing and ways of where we can improve and do better for not just next election cycle, but always, right? I mean, this is something that we have to work on every single day in order to get where we want to be.
Yep. Well, thank you all again. And thank you, viewers out there.